Whoa, that's a serious microphone. Welcome everybody to this event, which is, so I've done a couple of things today already, and this I'm so interested and excited about this event because it's very different from the previous events that we've run today, although it continues a theme about land, soil, and our connection with that. This event, I'm not going to keep saying I'm not going to talk for too long and then end up talking for too long. In a nutshell, Jim and Morag and myself started a conversation probably about 18 months ago, or maybe even 2 years ago, about something completely different. And then the whole conversation moved in the direction of understanding what it means when very high level politicians or representatives from the UN kick off their climate conference or biodiversity conference by talking about we need to become of nature and not above it, or we need to make peace with nature, or the economy needs to be of nature, not above it. And I think everybody would agree with the sentiment of that. But what it actually means to connect with nature in a practical sense is something that most of us have forgotten. Maybe when it rains, you wish you'd put your coat on because you get wet. But at a more fundamental level, we've lost that connection with nature. Most of us have. But this session is all about people who are trying to make that reconnection and people who never lost it in the first place. And it's about a sharing of knowledge. And the middle of the session is going to be a premiere of a film and a musical composition co-created by Jim and Morag at the front here. They'll introduce it themselves to give us a kind of headspace to sort of think about what it means to reconnect and how we can reconnect with nature. So we're going to kick off with a couple of thought changers in the space of thinking about what nature is, how we have broken that connection and its consequences. Then we're going to have the film and the music to reflect on that. And then we're going to have presentations from two Indigenous farmers, essentially, but people who've maintained that connection with the land, to tell us what that connection means to them. And then we'll open up for a discussion. So on the basis of that, it's a real genuine pleasure for me to introduce Stuart Kaufman. Stuart Kaufman is joining us from Santa Fe in New Mexico, I hope, who's going to talk to us about the work that he's been doing that spans concepts on origin of life, where life comes from, how life spontaneously arises and then continues to evolve, and the connection between that and the way that our economy evolves. Very fundamentally similar processes, yet very divergent consequences. So I'd like to welcome Stuart Kaufman to tell us about his ideas. Good morning, Stu.
Good morning, John. And thank you for organizing all of this and organizing the whole event. And I look forward to the film. So I'm Stuart Kaufman, and I'm here to convey to us all something we really don't know. We are where we are in the Anthropocene because of human cumulative technological evolution, not only for the 300,000 years of the lifespan of the Homo sapiens species, going back 2.5 million years to now. And the overarching thing to understand is that it is the economy, stupid. Our economy is $120 trillion a year, growing at 3%. It lifts us from poverty. It's how we earn our livings. It links us in trade. It's how we find much of the meaning in our life. But the same global economy is driving climate change, a mass extinction, and wave after wave of pandemics. That's the Anthropocene. We have a finite chance of getting beyond it. We can, but we have to understand it, and we may never, but we better do it starting now. Next slide, please. So 2.5 million years ago, our ancestor, Australopithecus, made this bifacial stone tool. They had about 10 stone tools. Next slide. This is Cro-Magnon about 30,000 years ago. Look at the exquisite pressure flaked tools. They had about 100 tools, ranging from this to the wonderful atlatl that allowed them to throw spears at aurochs. Next slide. This is the Great Wall of China, built around 500 BC. Next slide. This is us now on a space station. Our economy has exploded in diversity and sophistication. Why? Next slide. Well, that's planet Earth at night recently. Look how bright it is. First of all, why are all the lights on at night all over the planet? And 200 years ago, there were no lights. This points to the energy consumption that we have on the planet. Next slide, please. So this is an equation that I wrote down. It's actually very simple. Here's the idea. The middle term, MT, is the number of goods in the economy now. Suppose there's 40 goods in the economy now, then the question is how many goods will be in the economy in the next period, say a year from now. What is MT plus 1 given MT? Well, the idea is if we've got 40 things that work, we'll carry them into the next period, but we'll also try to make new things out of what's lying around. So you can take an axe and you can try to reshape it, or you can take any two things like the Gutenberg printing press to try to make something neat out of 2 of the 40. This is the MT over I, which is MT, choose I. So if I is 1, you're choosing any one thing out of the 40 and trying to make something new. If I is 2, you're trying to take 2 things out of 40 and try to make a new things like the Gutenberg press, or if it's 4, you're trying to find 4 things to make something, which is the Wright brothers airplane with airfoil, propeller, gas engine, and bicycle wheels. The equation does something astonishing. Please go to the next slide. It predicts this. And this is the stunning slide that is true and we don't know it. TAP predicts that for a very long time, there are very few things. Then all of a sudden it explodes upward and it will reach infinity in finite time. It is the first model of global GDP, the top world global GDP, over the last 2,000 years. It started exploding about 200 years ago. TAP explains it. But meanwhile, look at it. We're on a finite planet. Does anybody think that our global economy in fixed dollar terms, which it is, can keep exploding upward at the rate that it is? And the answer is no. That's why we're in the Anthropocene. So TAP does this. Next slide, please. So this TAP process predicts what you see. The green line is reality. Orange and red lines are the fit to it by our simple model. So we have never had a theory that explained how come we exploded from a few thousand things to billions and hundreds of billion things in the economy now. This explains it. And the central reason is easy. If you have to jury rig, would you rather find one broken thing in the garage or a few hundred things to jury rig with? Well, the more things you've got, the easier that it is. And that explosion is TAP. It's for the biosphere and species and for us and our technology. So I want to stress again, this process, the continuous process, reaches infinity at some finite time. It's not exponential. It's much faster than exponential. It's hyperbolic. There is, however, a gift from TAP. It's so easy to invent now that we can hopefully invent our way out of the Anthropocene that we're creating. I'll come back to that in a second. Next slide, please. This is us now. I'm 82. I was born in 1939. We won World War II without any plastic. The amount of plastic in that garbage heap is enormous. That's what we're doing to the planet. Next slide. So here's measures of the Anthropocene on various criteria, and it follows the same general curve. It's exploding upward in the last few hundred years. We're in the Anthropocene. We have to get beyond it. Next slide. So what we confront is we're beyond planetary balance. We're overwhelming the planet. We are causing a mass extinction and wave after wave of pandemics as well as climate change. For the first time in human history, we are as a species, among all of the other species, facing issues that are global in scale, civilizational in scale, and existential in scale. The most we can do right now at this COP meeting is we have to help a global conversation that recognizes that the problem isn't just global warming, it's climate, it's not just climate change, it's mass extinction and wave after wave of pandemics. We can recover from climate change in a few thousand years. We will recover from a mass extinction in 50 to 100 million years. We have to stop now. We have to find ways of inventing. It's so easy to invent now that we invent things that allow us to have an ongoing economy that also save the biosphere and all of the other creatures. In so doing, we can enter a new axial age in which we truly know we truly are of nature, not above it. Thank you.
Thanks, Stu, and I hope you'll be able to wait around for the discussion afterwards. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So here with us to talk a little bit about the consequences of this kind of hyperbolic consumption is Jo Handlesman. She's a former senior science advisor to President Obama, and she's just written a book about the way that our consumption has impacted on the planet, on Earth, and in particular on soil. And the book's called A World Without Soil, imagining a world without soil and the consequences of that. It deals with soil issues that are around the world, and her presentation is going to be a call to action to innovate our way out of some of these challenges that we've brought upon ourselves. So I'd like you all to welcome Jo Handlesman, who's joining us from Wisconsin.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for joining this very interesting session, and I'm really grateful to be part of it. I want to talk today about a world without soil, which is very sadly the future that we're facing if we don't do something. So Hannah, I wonder if you could advance the slides because I can't seem to advance them. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Our soil is under threat today. It has been for the last 150 or 200 years, very broadly. And I think it's worth taking a really quick look at what soil is, why we should care about it, how we're losing soil and how rapidly it's disappearing, and what that means for us and in terms of an earth and a people on the earth. And then finally, how we can protect it. Next slide, please. So soil is thank you. Soil is familiar to all of us. We've probably all seen scenes like this on a daily basis. Next slide. But how many of us actually think about what the soil is made of? Soil is a heterogeneous mixture of rock, which has been weathered over millennia. This rock is often pulverized into tiny particles, mineral particles that we talk about as sand, silt, and clay, depending upon their size. And there's been an interaction of living organisms with these particles, as well as all the plants, animals, and microorganisms that are acting on each other in the soil. So it's this extremely complex, probably the most biodiverse environment on Earth. This is an example of a very young soil on the left, which has no horizonation, which are the layers that you see in the soil on the right, which is a much older soil. It takes centuries for soil to make this transition, and soil is formed very slowly at less than half a ton per acre per year. That's an important number to remember, half a ton per acre per year. The value of soil to us is manyfold. Obviously, food security. We all think about soil as the place that we grow our crops, but it's also the source of much of the clean water on Earth. It's the largest water filter on Earth and provides clean water to more people than just about any source around. Biodiversity is more intense and concentrated in soil than any other environment on Earth. Antibiotics and many other drugs are largely sourced from soil bacteria. About 75% of our drugs today are from soil bacteria, and it's important for carbon storage. Soil obviously has a very tight link with climate change because it stores so much carbon. So there's about 3 times the amount of carbon in soil as there is in the atmosphere, and 4 to 5 times as much carbon as in all the plant biomass on Earth. So soil is a tremendous repository for carbon, but we have lost about 50% of the Earth's soil carbon since about 1850, when agriculture became highly intensified, particularly in industrialized countries. So it remains not only a repository, but a repository with lots of space for more carbon, which should suggest to us that soil has a role in mitigating climate change. So in the United States, just as an example, we're losing soil supposedly at about 5 tons per acre per year. This is an example of Iowa, one of our most agriculturally productive states. And you can see all these light areas on the surface of the soil. That's where the subsoil is showing through. So there's no more topsoil on those areas. These are examples of gullies and water erosion in the United States, but that is just one example of the many countries that are eroding soil quite rapidly. These are examples from around the world. This is from New Zealand, the Waiapu River, which is so heavily silted from this kind of erosion that you see on the right here, that it has lost much of its life and biodiversity. Climate change is bringing worse things to soil. So there's this two-way street between climate change and soil and climate change. This is an example of weather patterns across the United States, and I think they're representative of many parts of the world. For the first part of the 20th century, the severe weather events that we talk about so much these days kind of hovered around a mean. But around the 1950s, we started seeing a change. And every decade since then, we've seen this tremendous rise in the frequency of heavy precipitation or severe weather events. These are extremely erosive to soil. These are the most, the biggest threat to soil because the momentum of the raindrops has a direct impact on literally on the soil and erodes it. So some of the consequences are obviously we can't produce very many crops without soil. The particularly row crops, field crops, staple crops cannot really be produced at this time in any way hydroponically or under other conditions. So we need soil to survive, just to feed ourselves. Without soil, there is much less buffering of the floods and droughts that we know will come with climate change. Soil provides a sponge to take up water and release it as needed. So it has a wonderful mitigating effect on the severe weather events that we see so often. And as soil erodes, we will simply have less land to feed a very large world population. In the last 2 centuries, we've lost about 133 billion tons of carbon from our soil. So that's equivalent to 25 years of just the US fossil fuel emissions, 133 billion tons. So that says, once again, that soil has the capacity to hold a lot more carbon, but of course, a lot of that carbon that was once there is now in the atmosphere. So how can we prevent that? Well, Indigenous people across the world have been planting their crops in ways that protect the soil. And what we can learn from them are a few very simple principles. The first is no-till planting. Plowing is one of the most destructive things we do to the soil. It destroys the soil structure, which makes it much more vulnerable to wind or water erosion. We should be cover cropping in areas where there are not crops year round. So for example, where I live 8 months of the year, the soil is barren of crops. And without cover cropping, that soil is vulnerable to erosion during that non-crop time. There's also evidence from very old work with Indigenous people and then more modern work with experiments that intercrop plants. This is an old method that Indigenous people have used around the world. The idea here is, instead of having all rows of corn, in this case in Iowa, they plant 10% of the field to prairie plants. These are the deep-rooted perennials that originally gave rise to the rich soils of this region. And corn is an extremely extractive plant, so it leaves about 1% of its carbon at the end of the season in the soil, whereas prairie plants and deep-rooted perennials tend to leave about 70% of the plant's carbon in the soil. This very restorative practice, with just 10% of the corn taken out of production, reduces erosion by more than 90%. This is an incredibly effective means of preventing erosion, enriching the soil, and creating a more sustainable agriculture. So if we look to the lessons of Indigenous people across the world, these are the people who have sustainably farmed for thousands of years. The ones who didn't sustainably farm, in most cases, have disappeared. We don't have examples, for example, from Easter Island, where the farming and forestry destroyed the soil so badly that the people of Easter Island had to leave or died of starvation, and the population was reduced dramatically and has never recovered. But if we look to the people who are the extant populations of Indigenous people, we find, for example, the Maya, who have farmed sustainably for millennia, using a mixed cropping system in a forest garden system that is highly sustainable, enriches the soil, and returns nutrients to the soil on a regular basis. If we look to people in Vietnam, these are the exquisite terracings of Vietnam, where farming on slopes is possible because they have built these terraces that prevent erosion. There are many methods like this around the world, and the industrial world needs to be taking these examples as the model for farming for the future, or we will lose our soil. So I would like to suggest that we all heed the lessons of the history that has led to soil degradation. The loss of soil is tremendous in every country. For example, in the Midwest of the United States, 1/3 of our cropland has lost all of its topsoil, all of its topsoil. And that is replicated across the world. So if we continue in this way, we have a few decades of farming left, and anticipating a population of 10 billion people by 2050, that is a collision course that we cannot afford. With that, I will stop and turn it over. Back to John.
Thanks very much, Joe. So we've had a couple of presentations about some of the fundamental issues that's come from the disconnect between the way our economy runs and the way that nature runs. So some of the profound connections that Stuart talked about in his presentation about how the economy works by combining innovations is of course exactly the same process that works in nature. It's why most of life on Earth, for most of the time that there's been life on Earth, is pretty boring, and then it went bananas in the last 200 or 300 million years when we get this huge diversity and complexity of life. The same with the economy, and yet nature is constrained by natural selection and other processes that limit its growth, whereas our economy is all man-made in terms of the constraints that we apply and the simplistic way that we think about it. And the consequences of that, I think, very nicely illustrated in Joe's presentation when we're thinking about the natural fertility of the planet. So I'd like you to think about these concepts and what it means to connect or reconnect with nature. And there's a perfect opportunity to be inspired in those thoughts and prepare for the discussion that's coming later. And I'd like to invite Jim and Morag up to the stage. Morag Mckinnon, a BAFTA award-winning filmmaker, Jim Sutherland, an extremely famous Hollywood composer, and both of them extremely lovely people who are going to tell them about the process of putting what you're about to see together and giving a little bit more background to that. Thanks.
Good afternoon to everybody in the hall, and good evening and good morning to the many people watching online. We're very proud to be here to present our first outing with this film, this idea that we've been developing for the last 2 years with John and Glasgow University, with Stuart Kaufman. John, we've been Skyping with almost every week, actually, and discussing our thoughts and his thoughts. And Stuart Kaufman, we've had several sessions with. And this, for me, started 2 years ago when I decided to write a piece of music about Caithness, where I come from. And I used to lie in bed as a child listening to the various foghorns of the Pentland Firth, and I used to try and find patterns in them, in these horns that seemed to be calling to each other. And that was me started on a piece of music. And then COVID hit, and the skies cleared and the waters cleared. And I thought, wow, actually, there is a difference we can make. And surely it doesn't mean that the planet has to be ransacked by a raging pandemic. But nevertheless, this pandemic seemed to be nature fighting back to me. And I latched on to this idea of this glorious proliferation of nature, which is COVID, smiting us humans for doing what we're doing to the planet. And that kind of developed into how into the music. And Caithness, where I come from, is home to Europe's largest blanket peat bog. And that, of course, is a massive carbon store. It's a well-protected carbon store there, although they still put windmills there, windmills which are obviously part of our thinking towards a greener future, but they're digging huge areas of land and filling them with concrete to put these windmills there. So kind of an odd thing to be doing. But nevertheless, it's part of the celebration of soil that our piece makes. And I think we're very pleased to have this opportunity to be exploring it. We would like to thank various sponsors. John Crawford has been putting together a group of corporates that are looking at soil health, and some of them have very kindly sponsored this project for us, Bayer and BASF. We've also had sponsorship from the Traverse Theatre and of course Glasgow University. And various other University of Massachusetts, all sorts of people have been lending us footage and Creative Commons. And so we've had quite an amazing time, and this is the beginning for us. So this film represents 15 minutes of what will be an hour and 10 minutes or so of film. So the narrative isn't quite the full narrative. It doesn't present the positive vision of the future that we will eventually present. But hopefully that's in your heads anyway. I'd like to, Morag, speak a little bit about it as well.
Hi. Yeah, so Jim got in touch with me and let me listen to his music, which, as you will find out yourself, is incredibly evocative and beautiful piece of music. And as he says, this is only 15 minutes worth, and we're just in the beginning of our exploration of what this film will be. But in the dialogues that Jim and I have had, we've spoken a lot about the themes that are being touched on here. And one of those major themes is interconnection. And we've looked at, the narratives that we have, in the modern world about connection and about who we are in relation to the environment. And I think that's one of those themes that we're really trying to explore in the music and in the film itself. So we hope that you'll see those inroads that we're making. I think what's been interesting for us is seeing how in almost every realm of science, there's this kind of understanding now that you can't separate the individual from the environment. And, I think I saw this beautiful documentary about the physicist David Bohm talking to the philosopher Krishnamurti. And they said that thousands of years ago, this mistake of consciousness had been made where we had thought that we are separate from nature. And so, that's where we seem to have taken ourselves. But now we keep finding, that when we go into a certain environment, it will switch genes on and off, and that we have an effect on the environment. And there's this reciprocal loop that keeps happening. And what's really interesting is that taps right back into Indigenous belief systems, which have always talked about the interconnection with nature. So it feels like science is now saying what the Indigenous peoples have always said, which is that all things are connected, like the blood which unites one family. And I am quoting an adaptation of the words of, I believe it's Chief Seattle, and he said, humans did not weave the web of life, they are merely a strand in it, and what they do to the strand, they do to themselves. So these are the themes that we're looking at in the film, and I suppose music and image talk the language of emotion, so we hope that it connects with you. Thank you.
It's probably worth also mentioning just the title and what it means. Caithness was formed as the bed of a great lake 400 million years ago in the Devonian period. And around about that time, there was towards the end of that Devonian period, there was an ice age. And that ice age created the circumstances for fish in the oceans to need to be on land. The deoxygenated the oceans, and the fish eventually evolved to become land animals. Of course, some of them were still fish. But the idea that this ice age then could cause such a catastrophic effect on these fish, what might global warming do now? So I'd like you to enjoy the film when fish begin to crawl.
What a fantastic film. It's really wonderful to see you all here, and thank you to all who are joining. My name's Kayla Cohen. I've helped to co-organize this event with John at the University of Glasgow and with Carolyn Cole. And I think this beautiful score and beautifully put together footage, it brings to the fore the theme of a diversity of forms of knowledge. And that really is what we are here to talk about today. So often when we're faced with a crisis, as we are now, our first instinct is to race to solutions. And what actually really needs to happen, I think, is slowing down and actually saying, what are the diversity of knowledge forms that we have, and trying to really engage with the voices that have been marginalized. And this event for me is a moment to pause and to say, wow, okay, so global warming is escalating, so are our efforts to saturate nature with carbon. But if we prioritize carbon storage above all else, then we stand to forget the political and the historical aspects of land and what grows in soil, which is really where we're going to next in this event. We're going to zone into soil and the futures of soil and zoom from the global scale to the local scale now. What grows in soil is a political question, and who gets to decide how land is managed is a political question. These are the questions that determine whose vision of the future is watered and whose is left to wilt. And for many Indigenous peoples at the front line of climate change, sustaining soil is a matter of cultural survival. Soil health is wrapped up in Indigenous food sovereignty movements and land rights. If soil is to be revived to health in an equitable way, one that doesn't perpetuate the inequalities and traumas of colonialization that displaced and dispossessed so many Indigenous peoples from their land, we need to start listening to soil stories around the world. So joining us today are two Indigenous environmental experts, Garth Harmsworth and Jacob Birch, to share their visions for soil health in their respective homelands. Garth is a senior environmental scientist at Manaki Whenua, which is a New Zealand Crown research institute focused on the environment. And for almost 4 decades, he has researched Maori resource management and is recognized for bridging Western science with Maori knowledge. He's also a personal friend and mentor to me, and he's hugely enriched my worldview over the years. And following Garth's presentation, Jacob will discuss his vision for revitalizing First Nations foodways and land stewardship practices across Australia. And Jacob is a Gamilaroi Māori, who's a First Nations Australian man, and he teaches in the regenerative agriculture major at Southern Cross University. So without further ado, we will play Garth's pre-recorded message because it's about 2 or 3 a.m. in New Zealand, and then Jacob will kindly join us at a god-awful hour in Australia. Then we'll go to the discussion and the question and answers. So please do, folks on Zoom, type in your questions as we go along and think in the audience.
Tēnā, kia koutou. Harananga tēnā mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. And thank you for inviting me into this session. So my name is Garth Hemsworth. I work as an environmental scientist here in New Zealand for a government research agency. I'm also a descendant from 3 Indigenous Māori tribes in the central North Island of New Zealand. And I work at that interface between Indigenous knowledge and science. And I'm working on projects that cover right across the whole environment, but one of those areas is in soil health. And so we're facing an unprecedented number of challenges and issues on the planet at the moment. And a lot of those are environmental. And it's really an important time to start understanding other knowledge systems and other values and perspectives next to science to actually find solutions for a lot of these problems. So in Māori, Te Ao is the world, Ranganui is the sky father, Papatuanuku is the earth mother. And so if we're healing the soil, we're also healing Papatuanuku. And a very important Māori principle is tau utu utu, the principle of giving back. So we take a lot from the planet, but we don't give a lot back. So a lot of my work is involved in what are those management practices and those actions that actually give something back to the planet. So in terms of a vision, I have a very simple vision to save and protect our precious soil resource and to have Indigenous peoples' epistemologies, philosophy, beliefs, knowledge, values, perspectives recognised and respected and play an important part in finding solutions to many of the world's problems, global, national and local issues. So an Indigenous voice of knowing and doing, it sits alongside policy and science. So a lot of my work, I draw on those ancestral Indigenous teachings to enable me to do my science. So that's the sort of the future that I would see. And here's a very important old Māori proverb, whakatauki, te toto o te tangata he kai, te oranga o te tangata he whenua, he one one. While food provides the blood in our veins, our health is drawn from the land and soils. And I think that sums up very specially the bond that Māori have with the land and with the soils. And in terms of Indigenous Māori knowledge, it really goes back to the ancient, comes through to the traditional, historic. So there's really a continuum of knowledge. There is no beginning or end to Māori knowledge. As long as there are Māori, that knowledge will exist. And this is where I'm speaking from today, right down New Zealand at the bottom of the world. And there's another reference, and we're really in the southern part of the Pacific, actually in Polynesia itself. And there's about 80 main Māori tribes in New Zealand now. And there was a treaty signed, Te Tiriti o Waitangi, signed in 1840 between the British and the Māori tribes. So there's two versions, one written in Māori, one in English, and that's had ongoing debate. But there are 4 main articles. And so the second article gave Māori full exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands, forests, fisheries, other properties, etc. And this is the settlement patterns that happened after the Treaty of Waitangi, 1860, a lot of Māori land, and you can see the decrease in Māori land throughout the country because of alienation of land and the change in legislation from multiple ownership, colonisation to more individualised title, which allowed a lot of that land to be sold. And you can see the same figures and the decrease from 27 million hectares there around about 1840 down to a very small total of only 5% in New Zealand now would be called Māori land. And there is another shot just showing that it's about 27,000 Māori land block titles across the country. Around about 5% of the land in total now is Māori land. 50% is considered to be underutilised. So, but Māori land plays a huge part in the New Zealand economy, and we have a Māori economy worth around about $69 billion. And it's most of this Māori land is in the primary sector, farming, forestry, etc. But we had rapid deforestation mid-1800s to early 1900s across the country, and that led to a lot of erosion around the country and a lot of soil loss. So after colonisation, there was a move towards cutting down forests towards pastoral grassland, which now covers around 50% of the country. And you can just see the spectacular erosion episodes that happen just about every year in New Zealand and the hill country, particularly under pastoral grassland. So we are losing about 192 million tonnes of soil annually from land use practice in general. And almost 44%, almost 50% is coming from erosion in hill country and steep land. So they're very fragile landscapes. And you can see the big gully systems across the country. and what happens to a lot of the rivers and filling with sediment. And this is a huge issue for Māori in those erosion-prone terrains where some of these rivers are ancestral. And it also settles in terms of the catchment, settles out on the floodplains and destroys horticulture as well. But that's a typical scene here of pastoral grassland in New Zealand with deering. And that's across about half of New Zealand. And so my soil health program was really looking at how Māori regarded soil health, what were the key concepts and how did they use traditional knowledge to understand those key concepts around Māori soil health, and developing a longer term view of soil health, so a more holistic way of looking at soil health. So there was a need to understand, explore the meaning of soil health from a kaupapa Māori perspective, Māori values, principles, use, intergenerational concepts of guardianship, etc. And this is the model that we tended to use in a lot of our science now in terms of partnership and a negotiated space to working alongside science. We have the Māori knowledge on one side, the science on the other, and we're trying to move into a negotiated space area with respect, acknowledgement, where we can freely discuss our different knowledge systems. And again, for making management decisions, drawing on the Māori knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge on one side, science on the other, and through collaboration, we're starting to investigate a lot more around research, policy and planning. And this is another model called the Waka Taurua model, where we're really working in partnership with a lot of scientists and trying to work in conjunction. And this is the parallel canoes that are lashed together, and just showing you how we can work in partnership again. That's a bicultural model for respect and acknowledgement of other knowledge systems working side by side with science. So we've used kaupapa-based health models as well for understanding soil health, and these are very holistic. And we have taha tinana, the material state, hinenaro, the mental state, wairua, the spiritual state, and whanangatanga, the family or related associative state. And so these models helped us understand models around soil health and resource health. And you can see that in those models, we have environment ecosystems around the outside within the Māori belief systems of Papatūānuku, Ranganui, Atua. And so finding a balance in the system is very important. Traditionally, Māori acknowledged a natural order to the universe, a dynamic system built around the living and the non-living. Any shift in the system, for example, through human interactions and or impacts causes shifts in the mauri, the vitality, the essence, the life supporting capacity of the resource of immediately related components. And as a result, the whole system is eventually becomes affected and degraded. So a lot of these models and these frameworks are used all throughout our research, tackling different problems, even climate change. And some of our modelling work that we've been doing in the country more recently around soil ecosystem modelling, how to actually introduce interventions and practices into our work, guided by core Māori values. So a lot of our work is around understanding pluralistic values, particularly Indigenous values, and how they guide our work to understanding around soil health and how we can actually introduce the right practices and interventions in our work. So the present measures and indicators of soil health do not recognise cultural perspectives. So this is really where our research was coming in to start introducing some of those answers. And so we see in the present range of soil health indicators, mostly all science. And we are trying to get to this more complementary soil assessment monitoring approach, where on the left-hand side, we have a lot of knowledge based on kaupapa, what we call kaupapa Māori, which is really Māori research and understanding Māori concepts, frameworks, principles, models, indicators. And on the other side, you can see the science-based approaches, particularly using different indicators. We're using something called Hua Parakuri indicators and measures, which is a Māori organics approach to understanding indicators throughout the country. And then some of our Māori soil health concepts have been guided by those Māori organic concepts around special Māori values around things called mauri, the life force, the mana, the authority, prestige of the soil, and for making decisions about the soil, Mahanga Kai and Marakai, those areas where food is produced, and oranga ora, the measure of food safety and food health from the soil. So we can see by using those values, they guide us in a lot of our work around soil health. And this is how we've approached the work to date, using those key values as to what do they actually mean and how that's guiding our work, particularly on the Māori side throughout New Zealand, to investigating the right sort of soil practices that are appropriate to Māori knowledge and the indicators that we want to use in future. And you can just see how we've gone through and then start to look at what sort of data or evidence could we actually derive from those Māori values right through, based on whakapapa, which is ancestral lineage, that connection back to soil. It's very, very important. And so we've, seen that some of those Māori values and concepts are very, very important coming through that actually guide us to a more holistic understanding of what soil health is. And so we've drawn on some of that to give ourselves a range of definitions around soil health. And we produced a book based on a lot of the interviews that we conducted throughout the country, particularly with Māori researchers and Māori communities. And a lot of that's been documented into this Te Mahi Oneone Hua Parakuri, a Māori Soil Sovereignty and Wellbeing Handbook. So it's very much around the practices that we need to actually heal soil and the healing of Papatūnuku, the Earth Mother. And a soil-based future would be to save and protect our precious soil resource, of course, and using the right sort of sustainable land use practices aligned to kaitiakitanga and whakapapa. And Māori having greater decision-making responsibilities and sovereignty over land and soils. And so elevating the status of the resource to a prominent position, which is happening in New Zealand through our legal and constitutional frameworks as well. And I'll leave the presentation at that, and I'll send over the full presentation if anyone wants to study that in a bit more detail. So, kia ora tātou.
Hoping you can all hear me. Yama Indo, Gaba Buliagu, Gaba Bulalui. I say in Gamilaroi, hello and good day or good evening, depending on where you are. It's actually gone past 1 a.m. for me here in Australia. Let's check that you can hear me. Yep, cool. I'll just start with quick acknowledgement of country. Gabi dango irango aragay ngao, winangali ngangu walabago ngao galu. Winangala na ngayamarang gunima wayamagu. Gingangu winangay ngangu uni. Ngayangali ngananda. Winangay ngindai uni. So I just acknowledge Kabi people whose country I'm zooming in from tonight. I also acknowledge and pay my respects to everybody who's present today, and acknowledge the respect that you all show me. Gamilaroi is a language and a nation of people who I belong to. The unique language and culture of Gamilaroi is just one of hundreds of unique languages and cultures that make up First Nations people of Australia. I only speak for myself as a Gamilaroi person. I represent my own dreaming, my own Borugu. I'm also an Australian, and that used to be a badge of honour, but I'm not so sure anymore. Whatever Australia used to be known for, we're now known as the country open to the highest bidder, the country whose house is on fire, so we pull the blinds and turn up the air conditioning. You just look at our government plan for net zero. We're going to rely on technology that doesn't even exist yet. So never mind the Torres Strait Islanders already becoming climate refugees. I'm sure they can wait. Meanwhile, over a quarter of Australia is under gas exploration licenses, and that's an area larger than Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, and Germany combined. So that's scary because natural gas or methane is on average 30 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So if we're serious about climate change, we'd be leaving it in the ground. So there's a bit of hypocrisy here. Look at our response to COVID. It's all about following the scientific advice throughout the pandemic. Lockdowns because science, social distancing because science, vaccine because science. We've had the world's strictest lockdown with Melbourne going through like 260 days of lockdown. We've We sacrificed people's livelihoods, our food production, we mandated the vaccine. We did all this because it was necessary based on the science. We proved Australia is totally capable of making very difficult and significant decisions to tackle a global existential issue. So I don't know why we fervently follow the scientific advice around COVID, but not the extensive scientific consensus around climate change. Why do we allow climate change conspiracies to infiltrate the highest levels of government? But anyway, moving away from the negativity, I'm offering a real and practical alternative, and it's a proper Australian alternative. And I've titled it based around this idea of healing Mother Earth. There's a Māori collective I've been speaking with lately, and one of the elders over there talks about the healing cloak of Papatūānuku, and that's the healing cloak of Mother Earth. And this healing cloak is the restoration of natural environments like grasslands, forests, mangroves. So this concept really resonated with me because that's what my work aims for. So I translated it into Gamilaroi. It's Burin Nama Maramali Gunima, the shield that heals Mother Earth. And in this image, I've tried to create a shield that's made up of gunale. That's one of our traditional cereal grains. And I'll speak a bit more to the importance and relevance of this grain. So jump to the next slide, please. So I offer an ancient and holistic alternative that will practically address climate change. And it's not just climate change. We need to address the extinction crisis. We need to address the impending food security crisis, because like Joe was saying, we have a few decades of topsoil left, and we've also got these diminishing reserves of phosphorus, which we use to grow our food. We can't just get rid of coal-fired power and think that our work is done. We can't just replace one extractive or destructive industry with another. We're on a knife's edge here. So the choices we make today will echo through history. So you've got to decide what kind of ancestor you're going to be. So my solution comes from my ancestors and the ancestors of many other First Nations people of Australia. They once managed vast cultural landscapes that included grain harvesting economies. The map on the left is Tyndale's Ark. It comes from Australian anthropologist, archaeologist and ethnologist Norman Tyndale. And he spent decades in the field with First Nations knowledge holders and created this ark based on that knowledge he acquired. The ark depicts regions where grains were an important part of the economy. And you see it barely even overlaps with the Australian modern cropping region, which is there in the map to the right. And cereal grains have been used by Australia's first peoples for at least 60,000 years. It's crazy, but people don't even realise cereals like rice have been used here for at least 28,000 years. So for my ancestors, they managed these long-lived perennial grasses, and from these grasses, they harvested a highly nutritious grain. But with colonisation came disease, dispossession, poverty, massacre, and 15 million sheep, and this ancient practice was wiped out within one generation. But we're going to bring these grasses back. To just give you a bit of better context to why this work is so important and I feel revolutionary, I'll compare it to the ancient agricultural system with a modern cropping system. So consider wheat, it's a short-lived annual grass. So annual means that its life cycle happens within one season, as opposed to a perennial, which is long-lived over many seasons. So for wheat, for a large amount of the year, the soil's left dead. Any plants that try to grow are poisoned, and there's barely anything holding the soil together. Soil is ploughed, which, as Joe mentioned earlier, is one of the most destructive things you can do to soil. When it rains, topsoil washes into the rivers, or when you get high winds, it just picks it up and sends it over into New Zealand. So with nothing growing in the soil, there's no carbon getting put back into the ground. With nothing covering the soil, it's like this giant solar panel, and we get massive temperature spikes. There's no provision of ecosystem services. It's just a purely economic system. Modern crops have been bred for yield at the cost of nutrition. So now we've got overfed and undernourished populations around the globe. That's regardless of income or social status, because we're all eating the same nutrient deficient food. Modern crops require pesticide and they require fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizers are a big contributor to greenhouse gases. And in drought, you can't, and that's pretty much all the time in Australia, you can barely grow anything anyway. So slide 3, please. So conversely, I want to introduce you to a few of our ancient traditional grains. These unassuming little grains come from long-lived perennial grasses, which means they persist year after year without requiring replanting. So you're not, ploughing the fields up. The grain itself is highly nutritious. They've been produced without any external inputs. There's no fertilizer, no pesticide, no irrigation, all the while providing the soil with year-round living cover. And many of these species are the dominant habitat forming species within their bioregion. So they're providing essential habitat for the native species. And these grasses have roots that go down below 1 meter's depth. So they're putting carbon further into the soil profile and providing far better water infiltration during rain events. They can persist through the worst droughts. They can be grown as a multi-species crop too. So I've got some grain in here that's a multi-species mix of edible grass. It smells really amazing. It's like malt. So with that diverse mix, you're getting that nutrient diversity as well. And like when I mentioned with the maps, we aren't in direct competition with the conventional cropping industry. Rather, we aim to be complementary. So we want to give conventional croppers an option to grow these hardy traditional grains on that back paddock where they can't grow anything else. We're offering an alternative to the farmer who can no longer grow crops because of climate change or soil degradation. But I think the biggest thing is that we can use agriculture to fight climate change. So just imagine thousands of hectares of these grasses across Australia, putting carbon back in the soil while providing a highly nutritious food. Like imagine being the landowner, being able to plant a paddock of these traditional grains, then being able to pass that paddock on to your children and grandchildren without having to replant the crop. So they're self-sowing and self-perpetuating once established. Jump to the final slide, please. So I see this as like such a beautiful and uplifting way of doing some real practical work to help mitigate our climate crisis, the extinction crisis, the impending food security crisis. Like we just want to grow food. We're not trying to lock up the land to allow vegetative biomass to increase or sequester carbon. We're not relying on innovation and technology that doesn't exist. Just offering a very practical and holistic plan that comes with 60,000 years of accumulated knowledge and proof of efficacy. And I want to stress that this is Gamilaroi and Yuwalari knowledge. It's Wiradjuri and Parkinji knowledge, Mythica, Arnda, Warlpiri knowledge. It's Warramungu, Larrakia, Maru, Kokoroa knowledge, and so many other First Peoples knowledges around Australia. It belongs to us. Don't take it from us. Let us do it our way. Don't give us the scraps from the table. Don't put us in the back seat. Let us own this. Let us lead this, and we'll bring you along side by side. So I just want to finish by sharing my vision of what I think it could look like 50 years into the future if led by First Nations people. It's a similar vision that old Uncle David Attenborough put forward earlier at COP. It's a world where big picture goals like social and environmental outcomes are given priority over short-term economic outcomes. So in my mind's eye, I see my ancestors' country, and actually this image shows my ancestors' country. It's just down the road from where my mum grew up. My first job was out there on a cotton farm. It doesn't look like much, but this is one of the traditional grasses I've been talking about. So when I look into the future, I see a mosaic of grasslands full of traditional grains intersected by corridors of forests that are full of food and medicine. I see mobs of emu moving across country, just as I see the sheep. The brolga dancing in midair. I see the resilient soil rich with life. I see the damselflies emerge and flicker across the water, and fish leap to take a meal. I see clear water and nests in the reeds. I see the harvest time come around, and with it comes all the tourists, and the Gamilaroi people who live off country are coming home for the big ceremony. It'll go for days. People of all walks of life appreciating culture and country. There'll be music every night, singing and dancing. We'll eat traditional grain cakes, fresh fish from the river. We'll have roast duck and emu eggs. We'll burn the sandalwood and soak in the healing smoke. We'll all sit around the fire, First Nations and New Nations. We'll break bread together. We'll invite other First Nations mobs to come and share the harvest. And we'll share proper law and culture. We'll trade to strengthen our relationships and connectivity. That's the cornerstone of our resilience. And when the harvest and ceremony finishes, we'll be invited to share ceremony on someone else's country. Maybe on the coast to share the bounty of the ocean, or the rainforest to share the bonya nut. With 800 dialects in Australia, the caravanners and tourists will be kept busy moving to new language groups to share in their unique story around food and culture. So I see a bright future. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that really inspiring presentation and vision for the future. I'd like to invite out Morag and Jim for the discussion. And I believe we will be joined with a few of the speakers as well. So please do come up to the stage. Thank you. With, yes, our microphones. Yes. Okay, so I'd like to start. Is it possible to get the presenters up as well? Oh, okay. And I'd also like to introduce Professor Robert Barrett, who will be joining us as a discussant and asking a question as well to the other speakers. So I'll start with a question for Joe Handlesman and Jacob. Joe, I have a special thanks to give because I had the privilege of working with Joe on this book that's about to be published next month. And Joe, in the 8th chapter of this book, you focus on Indigenous cultures and the sustainable soil practices that we can learn from. And Jacob, you've just presented to us a vision for how to revive soil health and First Nations food pathways in Australia. So to you both, I'd like to ask the question of how do you think about the interface between scientific knowledge and Indigenous knowledge? What is the role of those two knowledge systems, and how can we start in a respectful way to go into the future? So yes, Jacob, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm pretty tired, so I'm going to be a bit slow. But I think for the Indigenous knowledges, firstly, it's not something to be appropriated. So over here in Australia, because I do a bit of work in the Regen Ag degree, it's sort of like this thought that we can just take all the knowledge and then appropriate it. Like it's not just something that you can pick and choose what you want. It's this whole, it's knowledge, but it's also the epistemologies and ontologies. Like it's the way of transferring knowledge. It's the worldviews. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of say that, yeah, it's not something we can just pick and choose what we want to try and, make things work or whatever. It's a whole worldview and system that, yeah, I don't think, or I don't know. Yeah, it just makes it difficult. But I think from the Indigenous knowledge is like I just gave you like something just then, like that's something we can use right now. With the Western science, it's probably how can we support that? So yeah, like if we've lost so much knowledge over here, I think we use Western science to sort of come in and help bring that into a modern sort of system. Yeah, I don't know. It's a tricky one. I get asked that one a lot, and I still don't know how to answer that. I don't know. I don't think I've seen it done well.
Thank you, Jacob. Yes, I know it's a very big question. I appreciate your sharing your initial thoughts. Joe.
Well, that's a tough one for a non-Indigenous person, particularly. I guess I would caution us against being extractive about knowledge, just the way we have been about resources. There's a tendency to use the Indigenous people's knowledge or just take and leave. And I think it needs more of a relationship than that. And I think that Western science and Indigenous knowledge have enormous amounts to learn from each other, but we need more of a melding, not an extraction. So I imagine a world where Indigenous knowledge is taught, and more importantly, perhaps Indigenous ways of knowing and philosophies are taught in our schools alongside with Western thought. And I think that would instill the values that are the goal of all of us, which is protection of the earth.
Thank you, Jo. And pivoting now for a question to Jim, Morag, and Stu, and your collaboration, which is also across knowledge systems, disciplines, and also understand that you've been quite inspired by Indigenous worldviews. Of course, there are over 5,000 distinct Indigenous peoples, and so it's important to note while we speak about Indigenous knowledge as a singularity, it's anything but. So just would love to hear about how do you work across science, your artistic practices, and also your interaction with certain Indigenous knowledges in that process. And Stu, you're welcome to join in that question after Jim and Morag.
I don't know. I think, I mean, me personally, and this is the discussions we've been having with, together with Jim and I, we've been talking about a lot of Indigenous belief systems. I mean, my family is mixed race Indonesian, so I grew up in Indonesia, and I saw, you know, that was my particular insight into a non-Western way of being, and it opened my mind up to that there's not just one way of doing things. Of course there isn't, and it's really important to embrace, you know, other ways of seeing and other ways of doing. And I think that that's what Jim and I have been looking at it. You know, I mean, the climate crisis has posed us massive questions about where we are and who we are. And this is what's been fascinating, especially, you know, talking to John and Stu and looking at things again in a different way. And that's the important point, that we found, you know, there just isn't ourselves and the environment. There's a reciprocal relationship, and that's kind of informed our artistic practice in terms of filmmaking, because we ask ourselves, well, how can we see differently? How can we observe the world differently? How can we look at the narratives of ourselves? And that narrative of self is usually, I am a separate entity from another person. I am a separate entity from the environment. So we were just looking at visual ways to tell that story differently. And I don't know if it came across, I hope it did.
I think it did.
It's interesting, the idea that anybody could own land, really. If you look at cattle, the cattle in the borders who become hefted to the land, they don't own the land, but they belong to the land. The land doesn't belong to them. And the idea that, you know, it's interesting, Indigenous, you know, Gaelic language doesn't really have a facility for ownership. This isn't my glass. I'm beside this glass. So the idea that land can be owned is kind of the root of a lot of our problems. We own land, we commodify land, it becomes something that we use, not something that we take care of because it nurtures us. And I think that's a kind of, certainly a route to the Indigenous beliefs in Scotland and crofting, and you know, it's a very interesting idea, this idea of land ownership. And I know that Jacob will probably have a lot to say about land ownership in Australia.
Maybe I can come in for a moment.
Stu, if you are speaking, we can't hear you.
Oh, can you not hear me at all?
Now we can.
I just had to talk a little louder. By the way, this is we're in Santa Fe, and this is that's Cocopele, a quite wonderful personage. We're in a very interesting transition. At the risk of touting myself, my dear friend Andrea Rowley and I just 3 days ago published a paper in Entropy. The title is "The World is Not a Theorem." I think we're right. I think it's the most important thing I've ever been lucky enough to do. Here's what's at stake. In Western, well, basically what we've done is we've shown that Pythagoras is wrong. Pythagoras said all is number. That led centuries later to the Copernican revolution. Then Kepler and Galileo and Newton, who create a mathematical system in which the world is a machine, with the reductionist dream that there's a theory down there called the final theory that will entail everything that becomes in the world. And there's a sense in which that world is a machine. This is the opposite of the indigenous picture, in which the world is living. What our paper does, The World is Not a Theorem, is we prove that you can use no mathematics based on set theory, which is essentially all of mathematics, to deduce what will come to exist next in the biosphere, new adaptations. Also, you cannot deduce what will come to exist in the global economy. You have no idea what will happen in the economy in the next 1,000 years. We could not have predicted the onset of flight feathers before flight feathers happened. This is not small, it's huge. And the reason that it's huge is that Western science, since Francis Bacon in 1560, in Novum Organum said, I take all knowledge to be my province, to put nature on the rack and wrest from it her laws, basically so we can control it. Western science, and I'm a scientist for 60 years, and Joe, you are too, Western science is pitched on the notion that we will know and then be able to command and control. Think of the great dams and so on. And it's wonderful in its ways, but it's also fundamentally wrong. The biosphere is literally becoming, in ways we cannot say. We not only do we not know what will happen, we do not even know what can happen. As we begin to understand that, we must shift our way of being in the world. We cannot control it. We cannot plan. We cannot optimize because we don't know what we unleash. So we have to be in the world in a different way. And here's a hope that not to put too much on our own recent paper, but it is part of, I'll say this, then go back for a moment. It is part of coming to know that we are of nature. We are not above it, and we never were, nor can we be. So I'll just finish with a couple of the following thing. My friend Scott Gilbert told me that the first words of the Hebrew Bible can be read in two ways. God created the past and the ongoing present. God creates. Well, God created is the one who is the transcendent God. I'm not religious, but God created is the transcendent God who can have authority and command and control, which is, for example, what the Catholic Church has done for years. But God creates is not that. God creates is an ongoing creative biosphere. In effect, that's what our paper is also showing, but the Bible had it right. God creates is an ongoing creation, then we are of that creation. We cannot be above it. We cannot master it and cannot control it. That transformation intellectually is beyond Newton and it unites us with traditional wisdom, which knew that we cannot command and control. We can partially, but not as much as we've thought. So what we need is a spiritual and intellectual transformation that gets us beyond command and control and domination. It's domination. We must get beyond domination, which is God created.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. That actually ties right into what I was going to ask Robert Barrett. I also think we are approaching time or past time. So just want to say thank you all to you for coming. We're going to run a little bit late, but understand, Jacob, that you are already way past what is fair to ask. But yes, if you need to go, then do go. So Robert, Professor of Education at Lancaster University, also Chair of Education and Engagement at Eden Project North. I know it's very late to introduce you, and you've got this amazing, inspiring project that's happening in the UK that unfortunately there's not enough time to introduce in full, but you are definitely one of the most inspiring people I've spoken to about really seeing the paradigm shift that we've spoken about today in reconnecting to nature on a regional level. So I'd love to ask you of the many ideas that we've spoken about today, what's been inspiring to you most? And then after that, we will go to any questions. Probably only have time for 2. Rob.
Kayla, thank you very much. And hello, colleagues. Really nice to meet you this afternoon, and also for those colleagues and friends that are watching and have joined into us. Such an inspiring session today. I'm just left here with so many thoughts whizzing around. I think probably the overarching one is that we actually do have hope, and we have a positive story ahead of us. And we have the agency as well to effect that change. But I absolutely follow Stuart's last comments in relation to us. We do have to move, I think, to a spiritual values relationship between ourselves and each other, the more than human world and the physical world that we're living in, if we are to create a positive space for us to all coexist in harmony as we go forward. So I'll probably just stop there because there's so much to say, and I'd rather leave the floor open for more comments coming from other colleagues. But I'm sure we'll be picking up in due course, and I hope this is part of an ongoing conversation, not just between ourselves, but some of those folk that have joined us today as we start to build a global narrative about how we can respond to and address to, and not just speak about the disconnection, but the reconnection opportunity that we have as we go forward in time. Thanks, Kayla.
Okay. Thanks so much, Rob. I think we just got time for one question from the audience, if anyone has. Or we can go to the online. Carolyn, would you mind coming up and reading one of the questions?
Yeah, so it looks like, Jacob, maybe you've kind of already delved into this a little bit, but Ali Gale asked, curious on Jacob's thoughts about the key obstacle preventing this return to traditional gains. Is it land rights, political will, money? So I guess your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I said it's all those things. I answered and I said I could start doing this stuff tomorrow if I had land, or if I had money to go and buy some land, or if the government would support us. They don't see the vision. I think that, yeah, the government definitely doesn't see our vision. We got a response from one of our ministers for agriculture. I won't say what state it was, but one of the biggest states, and they said, oh, this is going to take too long to set up and it's going to take too much investment. And we're like, oh, no, duh. Of course, it's going to take a bit of time. You wiped out an entire agricultural system. Like, you look at Syria, after their civil war, is going to take about $17 billion to get that up and running. I'm sure that's going to happen. Like, still waiting for that sort of stuff to happen over here. So, yeah, we do need a bit of time and a bit of money, but I think if somebody has the vision, they might be willing to support it, but the government doesn't have that vision at the moment. So I think the next best thing is, yeah, try and get a bit of land, or yeah, some sort of philanthropic or impact investment behind us. Yeah, because we could start doing it tomorrow, really.
Thank you, Jacob. I think on that call to action, we'll end this session. We thank all of the presenters for sharing your ideas, and the filmmakers and the sponsors of the film, and University of Glasgow and John Crawford for inviting everyone to partake in this, and to the audience. This decade is critical. It's amazing to bring these different visions of the future together, and with a deep understanding of how historical forces and how history informs the present. And so I do hope that we can make the progress that, Jacob, you would want, and that I think we're aligned for that. So thank you all, and goodbye.